What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Logical, Plausible, Probable. We got a kind of impromptu live stream going on with the one and only Sal Cordova. We're going to be discussing natural selection, specifically in regards to Fisher's theorem on natural selection. Sal was actually heavily involved with some different takes, shall we say, on that subject in regards to his work with Dr. John Sanford, among others, who have questioned this and put some different perspective on the whole topic. And Sal actually has part 2 of his debate coming up later this week with a evolutionary biologist PhD. They had round 1 back over on Modern Day Debate. It was a great, very interesting discussion, and they just weren't able to cover all of it because we had 2 very smart guys going back and forth, and they just couldn't cover everything in an hour and a half. So they're scheduled a part 2, which I think is coming up this Thursday, I believe. Is it Wednesday or Thursday?
Wednesday at 8 p.m.
Okay, so 2 days from now over on MDD. I'm guessing, was that kicking off at 7, 8 o'clock? What time is the...
8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central. Gotcha. Well, Sal, thanks so much for taking the time to come on and discuss this very interesting topic with me. So for those of you who are unaware, Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, it's an idea about genetic variance. Population genetics was developed by the statistician and evolutionary biologist Ronald Fisher. The short version of it is the rate of increase in fitness of any organism at any time is equal to its genetic variance in fitness at that time. Now, the more modern version of this is the rate of increase in the mean fitness of any organism at any time that is ascribable to natural selection acting through changes in gene frequencies is exactly equal to its genetic variance in fitness at that time. So that's kind of gives you the little top level piece of it. Sal, go ahead and take over from here and give us a little idea of what we're going to be talking about today. Well,
if that statement of the theorem sounds like gobbledygook, it's because it is gobbledygook, and that's what I'm covering today. I know that's not a nice thing to say of the dead, but got to call a spade a spade. So it has been regarded by Richard Dawkins as biology's central theorem, and if you go to the Royal Society web pages and biographies, it'll say Fisher created biology's central theorem. And the irony is, what you just stated, I think most biologists studying biology never heard that theorem. They've never heard what you just stated. They wouldn't know how to apply it to their everyday job doing biology. So,
quick interjection here. It seems to me that the more I learn about the subject, the more there seems to be fundamental assertions and assumptions that don't actually correlate with what's actually being seen in the lab, for example. Yet they're still clung to with nearly dogmatic fervor in regards to the supposed proofs of evolution itself. Is that a fair position to take?
Yes, and religious, mythical. And I have something, if I could share my screen. I wrote this article on this just to open with a little bit of comedy. First of all, I'd like to thank all our loyal subscribers and viewers who joined us. I see Honesty Angel there and Nicholas Whitmire and Standing for Truth. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I'm deeply honored. By the way, I want to thank you all for praying for Dr. Sanford. He's been having some health challenges, but I got 3 emails from him today saying he's very happy with the progress on my book. So we're all hoping and praying he will still be with us to see my books published, of which we're hoping he will be my co-author. The reason I say that is what I'll be writing on is a little bit outside of his specialty, but I'm expecting he'll at least write forewords. So I'm grateful to announce that. And so part of me getting on YouTube is to try to advertise some of our upcoming work. Redefine Living's here too. So thanks for joining us. So could I share my screen here? I'm going to share an article that is a little bit lighthearted. I took a little bit of artistic license, not much. This was an article I wrote on Fisher's theorem. Is it up? Okay. So this is on the creation evolution.
Hang on. Let me add it real quick. All right, we're good to go now.
All right, this is on the creation evolution headlines run by David Coppage. He was one of those expelled. He was expelled from the Jet Propulsion Lab because he was a creationist. It's not even really an academic institution. This is terrible what's going on. Anyway, the father of neo-Darwinism, that would be Ronald Fisher, he's condemned with faint praise. The phrase condemned with faint praise is, I guess, an English phrase. I'm not quite familiar with it. And the NAS, which stands for National Academy of Science, NAS members' comedic eulogy of Fisher's theorem of natural selection. So this is a way to introduce Fisher's theorem. So this is my take on it, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to read from it because
you don't have to make up the words. You already wrote them down.
Yeah. The father of neo-Darwinism, R.A. Fisher, put forward what he called the fundamental theorem of natural selection, abbreviated FTNS in 1930 or so. This mathematically impressive theorem, of which Fisher was very proud, was long considered to be one of the main pillars of neo-Darwinian theory. Almost comically, it is now referred to in some evolutionary circles as Fisher's not so fundamental theorem of natural selection. We might give it a corrected abbreviation, FNSF-FTNS. Bill Baster and John Sanford recently provided a correction to Fisher's equations in the FNSF-FTNS that demonstrated real evolution proceeds toward destruction rather than construction of biological function. It basically flips Fisher's theorem upside down. Concurrently, and equally comedic, something odd happened at the 37th Memorial Lecture on January 4th, 2018, meant to honor the memory of the late R.A. Fisher. Joe Felsenstein, a National Academy of Science member, condemned Fisher's work with faint praise. Basically, he criticized Fisher's famous theorem, but tried to do it in a nice way. After all, this was a memorial lecture intended to honor Fisher's accomplishments. As with many eulogies, Felsenstein tried to put as much whitewash on the failures of the deceased individual as possible. He said, quote, in spite of Fisher's assertion that the theorem, quote, holds the supreme position among the biological sciences, end quote, the fundamental theorem is, alas, not so fundamental, end quote. So there was the criticism, now the whitewash. How would Felsenstein manage to elevate Fisher's work and make it look like a stellar accomplishment, given that he's on the spot to eulogize the deceased father of neo-Darwinian theory? Well, Felsenstein may not have intended to do so, but he made Fisher's work look better than his own by comparison. He did this by pointing out how much more widely cited Fisher's work has been than the one of his own absurd models, which in turn he claimed is better than all the other absurd evolutionary models out there. Watch. I will not attempt to revive the FTNS, Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, which turned out not to be so fundamental after all, but instead am trying to extend a 1978 model of mine, put forth in what may be the least cited paper. This attempts to make a toy model of an evolving population. So this is my translation. So that was Joe Felsenstein at describing the this was him at the memorial lecture. So translation, I'm translating, interpolating what Joe Felsenstein is saying. I'm trying to draw attention to my clever idea about how evolution works, but which everyone else seems to be ignoring and hasn't gotten as much citation as Fisher's fundamental theorem, which wasn't ever really fundamental anyway. I have to make a toy model of evolving populations because real models are mathematically intractable. And it's better to have a model that gives inaccurate answers than no model at all. The comedy continues. Felsenstein said, the models are somewhat absurdly oversimple, but I argue that models like this at least can give us some results, which decades of more hand-wavy papers on the general connection between evolution, entropy, and information have not. So my translation is, my model is absurd, but it's better than the other absurd hand-wavy models out there. This lecture is in honor of R.A. Fisher. He made a model of evolution that is also oversimplified, was wrong, and now it's my turn to do the same. In relation to all the bad evolutionary models out there, Fisher's model doesn't look so bad. If we really had good models, I'd be talking about that. But instead, let me highlight my model that's been around for 40 years and which no one seems to pay attention to. At least Fisher's model gets more citations than mine. Sanford and Bassner's paper critiquing Fisher's theorem, first announced here, was noticed by Evolution News and World Magazine with favorable reviews. Now, here's a commentary. Felsenstein's solution to the dilemma of criticizing Fisher, yet keeping his status as the patron saint of neo-Darwinism, reminds me of this joke about a preacher who was offered a lot of money to do something similar. And the joke goes like this. In a small town, there were two brothers who, over the course of many years, cheated, swindled, robbed, and generally stole from everyone that they ever did business with. The entire town and surrounding community reviled and despised these two brothers, as everyone was aware of just how disreputable and dishonest they were. One day, one of the brothers mysteriously died. Although they had never attended church, the one remaining brother went to the local pastor and offered vast sums of money if he would only come forward to the funeral and say the appropriate words, and a large bonus, but only if he would, during the course of the eulogy, refer to his brother as a saint. The pastor was troubled by the request. However, it was a very poor church, and the church desperately needed repairs. The parishioners had heard about the pastor's dilemma and were curious as to what he would do. The funeral began. The church was packed, and the pastor started with the usual prayers and followed the rites and traditions as required by the church's teachings. In closing, after referring to the man in the box, he paused and turned to the face of the remaining brother. He began, as you all know, the departed was an awful individual who robbed, cheated, and swindled and stole from everyone he ever did business with. However, compared to his brother, he was a saint.
So if what I'm taking from that little story there is that the Fishers, among others, models are just different levels of badness rather than being, fantastic explanations of different questions. They're just fighting over which one is the least accurate. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, and I know that may sound harsh, but what I was going to present today, I'm actually going to cite Felsenstein's work and the work of other people. I mean, if I get under the skin of some of my listeners who are on the other side of the debate, there's an opportunity to discuss these papers, and it's better that these papers be discussed because they're being ignored, because they don't speak well of the mythology that, here we have, like I said, here we have this myth that Fisher's fundamental theorem is the central theorem of all biology. Now, I've studied a modest amount of biology, and I know people that have too. They don't know anything about this theorem that's supposedly central to biology. You'd think if it's the central theorem, they'd be studying it. Just like if we're studying physics, some of the first things that we studied was the approximation we know is Newton's second law. So I find it kind of amusing that this myth is perpetuated, and there's no evidence that it really is the central theorem, and it's not. But it took decades. It took decades for this to come about, and still to this day, Richard Dawkins is still proclaiming it as biology's central theorem.
Well, when it comes to Dawkins, that doesn't really surprise me, since he has refused to accept any new variation to his 1976 selfish gene position. The at least the things that I've seen, he seems to completely dismiss any alternative. So that doesn't really surprise me too much in regards to him specifically.
Yeah, I'm going to share another screen, and now we get to the boring part. I had to give something a little bit lively because Fisher's theorem is not, this is going to be a little bit grueling. So for anyone that is going to get bored with this and it's just too much, I'm not at all offended. As I said, I feel Fisher's theorem's gobbledygook anyway, but maybe walking through it, we can demystify what it actually says. So I'm sorry that I hope you're not. I hope you all are not offended that I'm just reading from my paper, because my words are a little bit more carefully crafted from my paper, and then I could pause and we can talk about what I said.
Oh,
so this is a draft. Okay, so I posted it up here. If you could help me share my screen. Thank you. So this is going to be in this is a preprint draft of something that's going to be open access in the Blythe Journal, which is friendly to, you know, they're quasi mainstream and they're really obscure. They're kind of second tier, mostly for like undergraduate students, etc. This is material that ended up on the cutting room floor. Just an anecdote. Bill Basner, and who's an emeritus professor of mathematics, and John Sanford, their paper got in the Journal of Mathematical Biology. And we know John Sanford's a creationist. The funny thing is, their paper got more downloads and views than any other article in that journal's history by far. Even when it hit 7,000, it already set a record. Now it's up to about 16,000.
Wow.
So I just think that's really amusing. The creationists, you know, salute the creationists for that. And as I mentioned in my debate last week, part one of the debate, debate series, Bill Basner got, he is so impressed the International Society of Conservation Biologists. They wanted him as keynote speaker, which was just incredible. So that was just really funny. We had a creationist speaking to an international conference of conservation biologists. And then later that same year, John Sanford, who has friends at the NIH, invited him to speak at the Mazur Auditorium, which is reserved for dignitaries. So that was just great. And some people complained. He said, "Oh, wow, this is the same auditorium where Barack Obama and Bill Gates and all these great people, and here's John Sanford," and they were so upset. So that was just kind of fun. So anyway, I just had to point that out. So what does that have to do with this paper? Well, editors were contacting Bill Basner and John Sanford and one professor of population genetics and award-winning mathematician who will not be named, to have a follow-on works to this. And Bill said, "Hey, Sal, I'm kind of pressed for time. Can you help out?" So our paper got up to about 100 pages, and we said, "This is not going to work. Can we make it down to 10?" So the authors had to chop. And I think so. You're getting the cutting room fragments here, but I think it's still good. Oh, by the way, greetings to Speed of Sound, Immutable Destiny, and Creation Myths. Thank you for joining us today. So I'll read the abstract, and this is a work in progress. Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection was called biology's central theorem, but ironically, such accolades are by and large a myth. Joe Felsenstein, when delivering the Fisher Memorial Lecture, with regret, declared FTNS was not so fundamental. Not only does FTNS do little to nothing to explain biological evolution, but like most population genetic and evolutionary literature, FTNS relies on a definition of fitness in terms of population growth rates rather than the biophysical notions of fitness, which are more in line with common sense intuitions of the medical and engineering community. From the perspective of the mechanical rather than the population growth notions of fitness, natural selection might be more accurately described as an agent against the increase of complexity, but rather a facilitator for the destruction of complexity. Thus, some sort of anti-weasel model of natural selection might be a better model of how selection actually works in nature, rather than Dawkins' weasel or other man-made genetic algorithms. However, the main focus of this communication will provide some pedagogical insights through some numerical illustration of Fisher's theorem. The hope is that this will show the general irrelevance of FTNS to the question of evolution of complexity by means of natural selection, and thus demonstrate in broad terms Felsenstein's regret that Fisher's theorem is not so fundamental after all. I'll pause here if you just had any comments, and we'll proceed. John?
Hang on one second. Yeah, so it seems to me that you're kind of presenting the fact that there is a huge portion of, the fundamentals, supposed fundamentals of neo-Darwinism that are based on a unproven assumption, and B, the assumption itself doesn't actually add up mathematically. Is it kind of a foundational concept there? Among many other things, obviously.
Probably the worst thing is their definition of fitness. And
that's right. I know you've talked about that quite a bit in our discussions and in a previous debate, I think with Ron Garrett. You guys were kind of discussing what is the whole premise of fitness, and does it actually align with what we're discovering? Is that right?
Right. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm not gonna just criticize this because of, I just think that's a bad idea. I'm gonna cite evolutionary literature that's been ignored. It's evolutionary literature by some really good guys, and maybe because they said things that the rest of the community really isn't happy about, it just gets ignored. They're still respected, God bless them, but they're not. They are not on board with the idea that fitness is well defined in evolutionary biology. That's really problematic. And lo and behold,
I would think so, given the fact it's a rather essential component to explain all the other aspects of the theory, right?
Right. I mean, if you think about it, in physics, we define things like length. I mean, length. We have the National Institute of Standards, NIST. They spend a lot of time trying to make sure we get length right, so that someone who measures length of something somewhere in the world will get the same length somewhere else. And another lab could. Same for mass. So mass, length and time, and then charge. Those are the fundamental properties of physics. And what is kind of horrifying, me coming from a physics background, an engineering background, is I would think that there would be comparable standards for something as fundamental as the notion of fitness in biology. But then I'm just going to quote what the biologists themselves have had to say. Oh, by the way, I was reading, since I'm referencing Behe's work in this, I found out he used the term that I used. He used the term nuts and bolts, which is what I used to.
Hey, Sal, quick interjection here. So your upcoming opponent has swung by. He's checking us out right now. So anything you're holding back for your debate, just so you know. Dan, aka Creation Myths, has come by. I'm kidding. I know you're not trying to hold things back.
No.
Actually, thank you, Dan, for coming by.
Yes, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dan, for coming by.
Appreciate you swinging over to my channel and to listen to this discussion we're having here with Sal. Go ahead, man.
Well, this is exactly what prompted the debate. I'd like to say I'm glad that Dan and I can have at least a conversation now. There's acrimony over the last 3 years, and when I put on the table the problem of fitness, which was related to this paper that Bill Baster and John Sanford put forward. Ironically, I said, John and Bill, you're starting from the wrong premise. Your definition of fitness is all wrong. And they said, well, we'll just use, I guess Walter Mind weighed in. And they said, well, no, we'll use the definition that evolutionary biologists have used, and we'll still show it's wrong. And I said, yeah, that's actually pretty slick. So, so the first step was just to even use, for the sake of argument, the flawed definition of fitness. And they still showed this is problematic. And as I've shown, even Joe Felsenstein said Fisher's theorem's not so fundamental. And I'm going to list all the other people, in addition to Felsenstein, that had negative comments on this theorem that's supposedly fundamental to everything. So the reason I'm having this recorded and I'm putting this on the table is this is technical enough. I want to have this recording available to people that'll hear our debate, because this is really kind of an important thing. And so let me just continue a little bit. So I'll give some citations. I'll have a bibliography, God willing, that'll identify these. So I might just articulate audibly, because I had the references somewhat in my head anyway. So I said, introduction and the problem of defining fitness. In order to understand the meaning of Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, it is helpful to understand the definition of fitness which Fisher was using. This is not so trivial a problem, because in a 2009 paper on fitness, Allen Orr quit, biologists have offered a staggering number of definitions of fitness. And worse, Richard Lewontin lamented, it is not entirely clear what fitness is. That's from his 2003 essay in Santa Fe Winter Bulletin. And then Andreas Wagner, in his book on robustness, he said, however, fitness is hard to define rigorously and even more difficult to measure. An examination of fitness and its robustness alone would thus not yield much insight into the opening questions. Instead, it is necessary to analyze on all levels of organization the systems that constitute an organism and that sustain life. I define such systems loosely as assemblies of parts that carry out well-defined biological functions. I define such systems loosely as assemblies of parts that carry out well-defined biological functions. Now, doesn't that sound hauntingly similar to this? Ironically, systems loosely as assemblies of parts that carry out well-defined functions sounds remarkably similar to Michael Behe's definition of irreducible complexity, a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function of the system. So, you see, because it's coming out of Michael Behe's mouth, people will dismiss it. But when someone like Andreas Wagner says that, that's okay. It's like, oh, that's so insightful. So,
hey, Sal, quick sidebar.
Sure.
SFT wants to know if you would be interested in doing this exact same presentation over on his channel.
Oh, I would be honored, SFT. Thank you. And yes,
if you look at the chat, you probably see where he's talking about that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. So, in terms of engineering or the medical intuitions of fitness, the population genetic evolutionary biology definition of fitness seems disconnected, if not offensive, to a common sense notion of fitness. For example, in the medical sense, sickle cell anemia is a heritable trait that can lead to sickness, but it is viewed as a beneficial, quote unquote, adaptation in the population genetic sense. Natural selection could selectively favor loss of optical structure in Gammarus minus, it's an aquatic creature that dwells in caves, or tusks in elephant. Alan Orr used the example of Gammarus minus to chide Daniel Dennett's naive views of natural selection when Orr pointed out. This was in the Boston Review. He's calling it Dennett's dangerous idea or something like that. I renamed it Dennett's strange idea. It's the Boston Review. This is a really interesting exchange because this is someone these are two evolutionists going after each other over the definition of fitness and natural selection. So this is not creation evolution. This is evolution versus evolution. Alan Orr said, in reality, selection sees only brute birth, death, and reproduction and knows nothing of design. Selection, sheer, cold demographics is just as happy to lay waste to the kind of design we associate with engineering as to build it. Consider the eyes of cave organisms who live in total darkness. If eyes are expensive to make, selection can wreck their exquisite engineering just as surely as it built it. An optic nerve with little or no eye is almost assuredly not the sort of design one expects on an engineer's blueprint, but we find it in Gammarus minus. Whether or not this kind of evolution is common, it betrays the fundamental error in thinking of selection as trading in the currency of design. So, there you have it. There's a top evolutionary biologist that is decoupling natural selection from necessarily creating designs.
Which obviously is one of the single biggest conundrums that's faced by evolutionary biology in the first place, right? Of like, how do we explain these massive jumps in morphology, among other things, purely through natural selection?
Yes. So I'm just going to keep going through. And, people will wonder, hey, it's really funny. Some people thought when I started studying biology, I'd stop leaning toward creationism. The more that I studied it and I read stuff like this, I said, you probably going off to school and reading evolutionary literature rather than seeing it quoted in creationist literature, actually going to the source literature actually just kind of disenamored me with evolutionary biology.
It's interesting you say that. Like I totally understand where you're coming from. The more that I read papers and digest their shock and awe at what is being discovered, and then read their attempts to justify the discovery inside of evolutionary theory, it's honestly rather entertaining, because you can tell that they're facing a rather desperate attempt to seem remotely plausible in their explanations.
Yeah, and I mean, I respect their efforts. They spend a lot of time, and goodness, I spent a lot of time studying evolutionary biology too. That the more mathy side, not the morphology side. So let me just continue here. In fact, reductive, which means reducing, reductive evolution rather than constructive evolution has been argued to be the dominant mode of evolution throughout most of geological history. That's Kunin's paper that he co-authored with someone's name who I can't pronounce. Just Google reductive evolution and Kunin, you'll find it. And it's little. He said that with little more than an assertion that geological history was punctuated with episodes of complexification with no real detailed mechanistic description for reasons of complexification. So let's assume for the sake of argument that the fossil record, and we have geological time and old Earth and old fossil record. Kunin was acknowledging that throughout this, if we assume common ancestry, we'll see lots of reductive evolution kind of, being the norm. And then you have this poof, like the Cambrian explosion, just poof of all this complexity that just comes out of nowhere. And then it starts to decrease. But then we also, we see direct examples, which I'll describe here. So I'll say amusingly, the paucity of direct examples of complexity increased by natural selection was unwittingly highlighted by Sherem Molem's book, Survival of the Sickest, where he argues why we need birth defects like Tay-Sachs disease because of natural selection. Furthermore, Molem went on to celebrate the facts of disease as evidence of Darwin's genius. Now, I shared, when I was telling John one time, I said, we were talking about Fisher's theorem. I said, you know how these guys had decided to, solve the problem of genetic entropy? They say now sickness is a beneficial mutation. And I gave him this book. He just started laughing. And I said, I don't blame you for laughing. That's kind of a clever solution. If you can't explain a bug, if you can't get around a bug, advertise it as a feature. So that's basically.
Hey, if the literal opposite is is reversed to be evidence in your favor, I mean, how can you lose?
Yeah, that's right. Now it's funny. I had a good relationship. God bless him. Alan McNeil at Cornell, who's the same school Dr. Sanford was in. He said, "Yeah, that is kind of a complication." So that was a nice way of saying, "Yeah, Sal, you got a good one there." So if so, okay. So if this is the case, then beneficial mutation in the population genetic evolutionary sense is often a loss of function in the medical and engineering sense. I really don't think that's beyond dispute. In my debate, Professor Cardinal cited elephants losing tusks, and he cited um, sickle cell anemia. I could also cite examples in the pangenome of E. coli bacteria. I may show that in my slide on Wednesday. So I say this is this fact is. I'm sorry.
Quick interjection in regards to the whole elephants losing tusks thing. I honestly am intrigued to know, and you may or may not know this, but I would not be surprised at all if the at least a portion of the loss of tusks is less to do with gene deletion and maybe more epigenetic.
Yeah, the term, I think the proper term is, I wouldn't use the word epigenetic. We call it developmental plasticity. Okay. And Mary Jane West Eberhard had a book on it. It was a headache to read. Goodness.
Okay, so the correct term is developmental plasticity. Okay,
developmental.
So the ability to make the modification is already pre-existing and now being executed. Is that
right? So when you're talking about locusts and grasshoppers, Mary Jane West Eberhard uses the term developmental plasticity. Who knows what term they're using in these days? These terms are so fluid anyway.
All right, enough of my little sidebar there. I'll let you get back to your Sorry
that's why I like physics. Some of the concepts have been stable for like 200-300 years. So, so I said this has been confirmed, especially by direct observation in field and in the laboratory. That's Michael Behe's The First Law of Adaptive Evolution, and published in the Biology Quarterly Review. And even what's his name? Jerry Coyne thought Behe did a good job, which is rare for Jerry Coyne to say that. But Jerry Coyne said that at least for the present day and lab observations, there was nothing wrong with Behe's tally. But then Jerry Coyne said, well, but Behe fails to recognize how natural selections worked in the past. And I wanted to say, time out, Jerry. It only works in the past in your imagination. We actually don't know it directly. The field and lab observations would suggest that natural selection wasn't at work in the past. That's why we have what's known as the third way of evolution. So just to think about this, an aircraft is fit to fly. A submarine is fit to operate underwater. A car is fit to operate on land, a spaceship in space, etc. None of these notions of fit need to be conflated with reproductive success. Biophysicists have established eyes are fit to sense and count individual photons and molecules. And the citation of that is William Bialec's work, his textbook on biophysics, plus his Hans Bethe Memorial Lecture, 2015. He had a series of lectures on this. Sharks are fit to sense electric field in conditions at the extreme limit permissible for physics. And there is an article by Natalie Tangier, New York Times. So that's the citation. Birds are fit to fly and navigate thousands of miles. This is well established. Just Google the Arctic tern and the cryptochrome protein and bird magnetic sensing. You'll just be wowed. Myself being a pilot and having worked in the aviation industry and trained pilots, I can tell you navigation's a big deal. Before we had GPS and all this high-tech electronic stuff, it was really easy to get lost in the middle of the ocean. How birds are able to navigate, and they don't have GPS satellites helping them, or to my knowledge, I don't know whether they can read star maps, but goodness. We have the Arctic tern that can fly from South Pole to North Pole and back, and they estimate it flies 50,000 miles a year because it uses a circuitous route, and it has waypoints right in the middle of the equator. Just incredible. I mean, if you could fly and you're just out there in the open ocean, how do you know that you're just at the equator? That's just like remarkable. Our magnetic compasses are not sensitive enough. In fact, most pilots don't want to fly with a magnetic compass alone because it's a good way to kill yourself.
Well, it's interesting as you're talking about this, kind of a direct comparison to, modern tech of, it's one of the things that really strikes me on a regular basis. The more I learn about some of the just incredible engineering functions that exist in biology. And to me, when you really think about them of, okay, yeah, in some instances we have no tech that's even close. In others, we haven't even come up with something that can do the same function. We can just observe it.
Yes.
And it's like, we're talking about technology here that is clearly observable. And as I always love to say, in what other context would it be considered logical, plausible, and probable that our equivalent of the exact same technology could ever exist without the intelligent agent being required? And if you're going to freely admit that you're correct, that I'm correct, that, hey, well, no, this couldn't exist without an intelligent agent if we make it. Like, so something that's more complicated and is being executed on as a molecular component, a molecular machine, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole molecular machine aspect is a freely accepted premise these days. It's not it's not just analogous. They're literal machines.
Yeah. It's accepted, except people that are really committed against design. A group of biologists said, stop using that word. Stop using that it has a purpose. Stop using the word machine. But it's too natural to just use it that way. Bruce Alberts, in his book, he was the head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was the one who used the machine metaphor. And of course, all the ID proponents and creationists were just celebrating that. They were laughing. And there's a huge backlash because of that. And so I tell
you what, the other day, a couple days ago, I was looking at, I was diving into the Titan the Titan protein specifically, and its role in muscles and contraction and all that process. And I was looking into like the actual step-by-step interactions that are required for a muscle to contract. And I was looking at that, I was like, good grief, this is nuts. I mean, just the level of complexity and all the inner working components that are required before you even get to the nervous system requirement. I was just like, wow, this is absolutely, I mean, I learned about this in the past, but I hadn't actually dove into it in much more detail, And as I was looking into it, I'm like, this is mind-bending. And we're talking about muscle contraction, which isn't even the most complicated piece that we see in some of the most simplest forms of life.
Yeah. So
sorry, I just started my little diatribe there. Go get back to what you were talking about.
Well, I'll tell you this. I was talking to a PhD physicist who presently works at the company I used to, MITRE Corporation, which is a $500 million, $1 billion think tank. Just amazing. The U.S. Congress will throw $1 billion for people just to sit around and think. And I used to work there. He's a PhD physicist, and I said, hey, these sharks can sense electric fields at nanovolts per meter. He said, wow, that's, he works on radars. And he said, that's phenomenal. I said, I think that's the limit of physics. And he said, yeah, that's probably at the limit of physics of what we can sense, nanovolts per meter. So this shark, just imagine this. He's in the water and there's his prey. When his prey moves his muscles, when the prey moves its muscles, it creates electrical signals in its nerves. The shark can sense that. That's how he senses it. And they had a lot of physiologists looking at this, and then they got the physicists involved, and they said, oh my goodness. And I think I have a quote from Natalie Angier somewhere in one of my talks where she said, these are so finely tuned, you need an alternate universe because it's right at the limit of physics that's physically possible. What the laws of physics would allow, we're talking Pauli, Planck, at Albert Einstein, those are kind of her words. You can't get any better. And so William Bialek had his lecture, More Perfect Than Imagined. So we often hear evolutionary biologists just trashing the design of biology. And here comes along a physicist. He said, no, that's not right. There are elements of biology that are perfect. You cannot exceed it.
Mm-hmm.
No human being, you cannot take all the talent on the planet and make a system more sensitive in that dimension. And that was powerful. That's a great lecture to go over. And so, by the way, that stuff made it to the cutting room floor when I was working on Fisher's theorem, because we had like only 10 pages and it's 100 long. So I just like, oh man, this is the really good stuff, you know, and it's getting thrown out. So now I'm presenting it. So thus the definition of fitness in the population genetic evolutionary sense may seem irrelevant, if not repugnant to common sense notions of fitness in the medical and engineering sense. But one cannot understand Fisher's theorem without understanding the definition of fitness on which Fisher's theorem is based. Therefore, the next section will be devoted to elucidating the population genetic definition of fitness. The definitions follow from conventions used in Joseph Felsenstein's graduate level textbook, Evolutionary Theoretical Genetics. He's made it available free. Anyone can look that up. The population genetic definition of fitness arises in the context of a highly idealized model that approximates some real-world populations, namely populations in an exponential growth stage. The notion of fitness in this simplest of models can be extended with modest amount of amendment to a large amount of existing literature in population genetics. However, the staggering amount of population genetics literature that uses this simplistic model does not at all imply the model is accurate or useful. And if inaccurate, if inaccurate, then the widespread acceptance of this simplistic model is a substantial blemish on the entire discipline of population genetics in this respect. Felsenstein may have obliquely conceded the state of affairs when he said, quote, Fisher and Wright's one locus equations turn out to be approximations, sometimes bad ones. The mathematical tools at hand have not revolutionized our understanding of the evolutionary process. Many evolutionists will fail to find the clear and simple messages that population genetics theory once seemed to promise. So what has happened is all these population genetics at the time of Fisher, Haldane, and Wright, it looked like they were just gonna just figure it all out. You know, we have Fisher's fundamental theorem, and you have brilliant guys like Wright and Haldane. And we thought, hey, you know, neo-Darwinism's, it's going to explain everything. We got this, man. We got this. So by the 1980s, it just all collapsed. It all collapsed. And it's like, well, you know, this was never in the headlines. This was from Joe Felsenstein's, he wrote this sometime in the 80s. Don't quote me on the time frame. The essay is Mathematics versus Evolution. Mathematics versus Evolution. Now, that's really kind of a funny title because that's something a creationist would write. And he even calls people that accept evolution evolutionists. So I know Speed of Sound hates us calling them evolutionists, but you know what? Evolutionists.
I'm going to interject on this one because I've had people tell me that it's not actually a word. It's literally in the dictionary. And it pretty much, the definition constitutes the way, at least I use it. So at some point, guys, got to get over your fantasy land that word does not actually exist. Yeah. And is recognized as a literal one, not just a random assertion.
Yeah. So here it is. I mean, this word was used by one of the, he's been called the mastermind of evolution because he is brilliant. Although when he saw my essay that kind of made fun of him, I don't think he ever forgave me for that. That's kind of the end of our cordial relationship. Okay, so now I hope you've at least been entertained so far. So now, unfortunately, a lot of preliminaries are needed to provide a cursory understanding of the terminology associated with the population genetic evolutionary definitions of fitness required to understand Fisher's theorem. So one must suffer through some of the math in order to understand what Fisher's theorem means. So here we go. These are simplified from Joe Felsenstein's book. So there's some fine points that my wording may miss. If you want the real deal, he has like a 600-page book, and you'll get the real deal there. I'm trying to condense this, so I'm not going to be terribly precise in just a few pages. So because populations grow exponentially, it is possible that a singular molecular change in one organism can result in immense macroscopic consequences. For example, in the evolution of bacteria or a virus, the emergence of a novel mutational change in its genome can result in its epidemic spread that has very noticeable effects on the macro scale. In light of such exponential growth of such populations, there is reasonable justification for choosing an exponential function for modeling populations such as these, and this leads to the beginning of the mathematical definition of fitness in the sense of population genetics. Now, I just threw a little bit of preliminary math there, but the equation that you should see, you'll see this in population growth models, is this x of t equals a to the e alpha t. So I'm sorry to get technical in the math. That just means the x of t is the size of the population at any time. So if you have parameters of like how many, a is the number of initial individuals in the population, a is some sort of growth rate. But just think of that exponential curve. So if you're looking at the number of people that, since the time of Noah, like you had 8 people, and then it exponentially grows to the 7-8 billion we have today. That's an exponential curve. You can model it with that equation right there. So I don't know how to. I'm trying to dumb this down so we don't get bogged down too much in the math. And unfortunately, to understand Fisher's theorem, that's what we're going to have to do. We can define this thing called W. And they call it the absolute fitness or Darwinian fitness. W equals e to the alpha. We can call it that. So it bears mentioning that W, calling it Darwinian fitness, might be a misnomer, since Lewontin argues implicitly that fitness in this way violates the spirit of what Darwin meant when he said, Darwin's sense of fit has been bypassed. So Darwin may not really like this definition of fitness, where you're just counting the growth rate. So what does this mean? So what could W, let's give an example of what W means. So if we had a rabbit, let me see if I could do this right. Let me do the math. Trying to do the math in my head. This is kind of dangerous because I'm doing this on the fly. So let's say a rabbit has lots of kids and it can double its population, assume that there's no predation or any other thing. But on average, all factors considered, that it's in a great environment, it could double its population every generation. We'd say W equals 2.
Okay.
And let's say that the human population every generation could increase it by, say, 20%. So W would be 1.2. Now, there's some subtleties here. The reason I use e to the alpha and use these t's, there's this whole thing. It's very nice if you can take a continuous growth model and make it discrete, where you just kind of approximate one generation at a time. And we know that that's not exactly accurate. And Felsenstein devotes tens of pages to saying, okay, this is when this approximation will be valid. Okay, so the reason I'm picking the discrete model is the math is easier, and he uses a lot of the discrete models in his examples. It's very nice to see this, and I'll show the discrete version of Fisher's theorem, which can be expanded to the continuous. So I hope the people are not too hung up on that. I'm trying to keep this simple. And so we can define the initial population size according to generation. So generation 1. So let's just take the rabbit example. So let's say we start out with 2 rabbits and W equals 2. So after the after the 8th generation, there'll be 256 rabbits, and after the 12th generation, there'll be 1024. So W would equal 2, and K at 8 generations would be 8. So W to the K. So that's how that would work. It just boom. So that's how Fisher defined fitness. Has nothing to do. Just let me take a pause here.
Doesn't actually look at the positive or negative ramifications that have happened throughout that process. Just that, oh, it must have all been ultimately positive. Is that a kind of a short nutshell of what's being argued?
Yeah, let's take a pause here. If you're thinking, what relevance does this have? It's like that's the same thing. That's the same question I was raising when I was looking at this. Does that tell you that a flagellum's going to evolve, or a prokaryote's going to evolve to a eukaryote, or any of the other problems, or like lungs? I mean, this equation is kind of like you've abstracted so many details as to be totally meaningless. But so if the reader is here, it's like, what the heck is this gobbledygook about? What relevance? It's like, well, that's exactly the problem. These guys have just gone off on this. This is the build up to the fundamental theorem of natural selection. You can already see the beginning of problems here because it's so decoupled from anything real. And if you recall earlier up here, it said, even from Felsenstein's mouth himself, he said, Fisher's and Wright's one locus equation turn out to be approximations, sometimes bad ones. Okay. You know what? That was an actually optimistic appraisal, in my opinion.
Quick insertion here, Sal. It seems to me that one of the things I love to talk about is fruit of the poison tree. But to me, it seems that what you're kind of outlining here has a significant amount of downstream ramifications, at least potential downstream ramifications, in terms of the assumptions that are built upon this that are being leveraged in a plethora of other models that are created in supposed defense and creation of evidence in favor of the theory itself. Am I going down the right? Is my mind going the right path here? Because that's kind of what I'm taking from this.
Yes, you're absolutely down the right path. And I've been talking to my colleagues, and I said, how could so many careers be built on models like this, premises like this, where they're doing all this fancy math, and I'm just like, it's all garbage underneath. I mean, that's a really harsh assessment, but I'm just like, this is not. I mean, coming as a physics,
not to the extreme, but it's almost like saying that all the formulas that use pi say that pi is somewhere between 3.14 and 2.14 and 3.14 kind of thing in terms of calculation of all the other formulas and the ramifications. Is that kind of a fair? Obviously not. Don't put on your physicist hat too much in mathematics. I'm trying to put this in context for the average listener.
I'll tell you what, this is so bad, I can't even say it's right or wrong. I mean, I'm sorry to be harsh. Now, the one thing I did in my debate with Professor Cardinal on last Thursday is I pointed out the Mueller limit. See, the reason I had Dr. Sanford put that in his slide when he talked at the NIH, and we've been talking about this, I said, John, the Mueller limit stands whatever definition of fitness. So if you use the population genetic definition of fitness, that Mueller limit will work. If you use the functional definition, the Mueller limit will work even better. And that's why I want you to use it. And he said, yeah, that's pretty good. And I said, here, see, Dan Grauer himself said he used that formula. People think that was something the creationists came up with. So when Dan Grauer said, if ENCODE is right, that means females have to bear 10 to the 35th. Every female has to bear 10 to the 35th offspring. And I was just laughing. I said, see, that's the formula that came from population genetics. There are few gems and all that doo-doo. Okay, that was one of them. That's the one thing we could agree with. So I'll show all this math that I don't like, that I disagree with. The one bit of math that I actually do agree with from population genetics was one that Dan Grauer used. And it was really funny. There was that part in the lecture that John Sanford was giving, and Dr. Grauer was just kind of growling at the ENCODE. He said, this is, if we assume that it's 80% functional, that means about 80 bad mutations per generation. That would mean every female has to bear 10 to the 35th offspring. And John Sanford said, Dr. Grauer is absolutely right.
That's now, if I remember correctly, in your debate, I think one of the points you were making was that even if it's the overall genome that's functional is what, 11, 12, 13%,
Yeah.
mathematically you run into the same problem. Is that right?
You only, well, not quite as bad. Each female only needs to bear 44,000 offspring. Now, there have been alternative suggestions like synergistic epistasis and soft selection, but the interesting thing is the playbook by Dan Grauer is not to even invoke that. He invokes that the genome's not functional. That's a standard play for that. And I said, that's interesting. Not every evolutionary biologist accepts soft selection. Now, all this will be moot, sadly, if we actually start to see decline in our physical fitness in the medical sense. And I cited one thing and someone said, you didn't cite anything. He cited that in the comment section. I said, didn't you see all the scientists I listed? You could look them up. And then I specifically cited this thing by Michael Woodley of Meany. He said our IQs are declining. And a lot of eugenicists, ironically, over like the last 200 years, have been saying exactly that. So
interesting is as you and I have talked about before, if you go and read the medical research papers on what they're discovering in genetics and the non-coding regions, junk DNA, whatever term you want to put on it, they seem to be rather aggressively stating that they are finding, their research is showing that there is significantly more of the genome that is functional, basically day by day in their discoveries. Oh, we just found out that this disorder is caused by this, and this disorder is caused by this, and oh man, this disorder is caused by this. It's very interesting.
Oh yeah. I was at the ENCODE Users Conference 2015, and by the way, they totally didn't even mention Grauer's name. No surprise. I was just trying to listen in on what they were saying. And they said, "Oh yeah, I'm working on this disorder, and we found it in this region that's like 1 million base pairs away in non-coding, away from the gene under consideration." And then there were some ones like on the vitamin D receptor, where it's just all over the place, all over the genome. We have these binding sites where the vitamin D receptor binds, and just like there are all these places where there's all this function, and there was just like researcher after researcher. And there was a paper, not a lot of people know it. Francis Collins himself was co-author, and I don't have the citation in my head handy, but 90% of heritable diseases, genomically related diseases, not just heritable, but genomically, are in the non-coding regions. What I mean by that is someone can get cancer.
Did you say 90%?
Yeah.
Wow. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest, but because, wow. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry. That does not surprise me whatsoever. That's very interesting information, though.
And of course, our opponents will say, well, that doesn't mean 90% is functional. And I'm just like, well, yeah, strictly speaking, yeah, but, why is it such an evil thing to make that as a working hypothesis that 90% is functional? If you're finding so many diseases. So that's what I'm sorry, I just had to wail on some people, but I found that Dan Grauer's behavior, these guys, these medical researchers at the NIH are just trying to cure diseases. They're just doing their job. And when it slipped out of their mouth that they thought 80% of the genome actually serves a purpose, that got him really mad. And I'm just like, especially that's none of your business.
Especially the functions they're finding with pseudogenes and other transposable elements and supposedly virus RNAs and things that are sitting in there and then just get activated and turn into a protein. Those really crack me up of when you're looking at what are some things that are functional. Well, I would say all of the above would be easily classified as functional when we now have direct observed and quantified evidence of their end result function.
Okay, so I'm not even a third way through my paper. I'm just going to try to blaze through the math.
Oh, go for it.
Anyone that is math savvy and wants to suffer through this, be my guest, and I warmly will receive any mathematical corrections because I've made a few errors in the symbols, but I know that the proof is correct because I basically reconstituted Joe Felsenstein's work. So, I mean, I had to add some clarifying notations. So this isn't my proof. This is a proof this is a textbook proof, but with some kind of clarifying notation. So if you see it and it doesn't look exactly like in Felsenstein's book, there's a reason I did it. It's to clarify it, to demystify it. So anyway, the point is, okay, so equation 211, that means, like, say we had the rabbits that could reproduce, with every generation at a rate of twice as much. So let's say we have subpopulations of rabbits. One subpopulation of rabbits can reproduce at 3 times as many as their parents. Like every parent will have 3 kids on average. And then there's another subpopulation that can only reproduce at 2x, 2 rabbits per parent. Does that sort of make sense? So we can represent each of these different classes of rabbits, and these are idealized rabbits. They're not real rabbits, okay? I'll call them haploid asexual rabbits, and we're only looking at one locus. Again, this is a simplification, but what was really funny was we had all this mathematical literature, tons of it, papers and papers. And I said, you got to be kidding. You're only studying one gene. You're not even looking at a genome with multiple genes. You're studying one gene in a haploid asexual population. You have tons of literature on this. It's like, guys, this shouldn't be that hard.
Well, especially now that we're starting to realize the influence of other genes on a specific gene before you even consider the other regulatory components that are affecting those genes, right?
Right. And that we call that epistasis, and then also mechanically linkage. And that's not even thrown into this. So these are simplistic models, but if you're thinking, wow, this is really simplistic, why is this relevant? That's my point. That's my point.
So basically what you're saying is we've got a formula that's supposedly explaining this, but we're leaving out gigantic portions of elements of the equation.
Yes, and when we start to put it in, it was devastating. And I'll cover that much later. So I'm just going to try to walk through.
I'm going to shut up. You go ahead.
So just think this is all that this P means. It's just population. So let's say at some point we have, after 3 generations, we have 1,000 blue rabbits and 500 red rabbits and 200 green rabbits. And that's all that this formula will represent. And it's showing how those numbers will change over time. That's all it's doing. So we're just kind of doing an accounting. And you can also kind of scale this in terms of proportions. So instead of, like, say, if you, so let me try to do this in my head. Oh my goodness, this is dangerous. So let's say we had a total population of 1,000 rabbits in the 3rd generation, 1,000 rabbits. So we have 700 red rabbits, 300 green, 100 green rabbits, and 200 purple rabbits. We could make proportions of that. So there'll be, so the proportion of red will be like 0.7, and the proportion of whatever I just said. It's easy to, this is just all it means. The lowercase pi is just the proportion of that allele or that individual. And in the haploid asexual single locus case, the number of individuals equals the number of alleles, or something like that. My mind's kind of getting a little exhausted, but it's here in the paper. And so we can also...
it's okay, Si. You don't have to be doing high-level math in your head live.
Yeah, I'm running out of sugar upstairs. I need a Snickers bar break. So let's say the rabbit here I set up a table. Say one rabbit is able to per parent has 4 kids. So one rabbit has 4 kids per parent. Another kind of rabbit has, so let's call this red rabbit, and the green rabbit has only 3 kids per parent, And then the purple rabbit has only 2 kids per parent. So these are just W numbers. And then all we have to do is we can scale this to give it the relative fitness. So we just divide everything. We just take the most fit, quote unquote, rabbit, which is the one that has the most kids, and just divide all these numbers. So we just scale it down. Do you see that? I'm just scaling. I'm dividing each number by 4, and then you get something like that. So that's relative fitness. So you'll hear the term relative fitness. That's all there is. So when you're reading, I'm just like, oh my goodness, this is all that it meant. I thought it was something really mystical. It's not. It's just tedious. It's just tedious. And if we take the proportion in a certain generation and multiply it by the relative fitness, we get something called the mean fitness. You'll see that a lot. So when they say the fitness of the population is increasing, they're referring usually to the mean fitness, mean fitness. Again, and then for those with statistics background, there's what they call the variance in fitness. This is again just like regular statistics. So you have the mean and variance. When people do statistics, like say for the normal distribution, they'll say there's a mean and variance that describe this curve or whatever. This is just statistical stuff. So with that mythical scenario, all I did is I came up with some, the relative fitness numbers that are based on rabbits with this reproduction rate here. So if we have rabbits with this reproduction rate here, the red rabbit being 4, the green rabbit with 3, and the purple rabbit with 2 offspring per parent. So you could see that the red rabbit is just going to dominate the population after so many generations because he's producing like rabbits.
Right.
So I just plugged those numbers in and, grind through the numbers. And then I said, okay, let's say they have initial allele frequencies so that the red rabbit starts off with a very small proportion of the population, just 10% of the population, but he's really going to make lots of babies over time. And the purple rabbit has a large proportion of the population, but he doesn't reproduce quite as fast. And said, let's just grind this through. I mean, this is a very simple simulation. Any software guy could do this in a day, if not a matter of hours. And you just grind through it, and you do all these calculations. So you calculate the mean fitness and the variance, and then you calculate the change in the mean fitness from generation to generation. And then you do a little fancy math and say, well, what's the variation divided by the mean fitness in the present? And you'll notice that the column on the left is identical to the column on the right. And that's Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. And that's supposedly the fundamental theorem, biology's central theorem. And I looked at that. I said, you got to be kidding me. That says nothing. That doesn't tell me that an ATP synthase is going to evolve or that chromatin will evolve. It says nothing of that.
Now, are these formulas a component of the evolutionary algorithms that are used for things like phylogeny studies and all that kind of stuff?
No.
These are separate? These
are separate. See, that's what's really bad. See, not even in evolutionary phylogeny do they use this. Not even in, kind of the most important stuff that evolutionists focus on. It's not even central to that.
So if I'm understanding correctly, what you're explaining now is supposedly a proof that justifies the other algorithms they come up with for those other types of things we're talking about, phylogeny and whatnot. Those are operating on the assumption that this one is correct.
No, not even that.
Okay, they're not even going that far.
No. This is how bad, I got to tell you, this is how bad the situation is. And because Fisher was so revered, you get an obscure paper that would criticize him, but, he was great as a statistician, not trying to take away any brilliant mind. But his theorem, it was just like, how it is when your friend kind of screwed up and You really don't want to hurt his feelings, and you want to kind of uphold his reputation. I mean, that's a noble thing to do. I don't think it was a conspiracy. I think that's an honorable thing to do when someone you love and maybe he has something there that just, there's no need to call out something. Let the creationists do that. I'm not going to do it if I'm an evolution. I think that's actually a noble thing. So I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's actually admirable that, they said, well, we're just going to let it go. We're not using it anyway. No need to, to throw more dirt on someone's grave. And I'm not faulting anyone. Except I am laughing at Richard Dawkins that he probably never even studied this, because he wouldn't be calling it biology's central theorem. I mean, that's kind of embarrassing. I probably know this better than he does. Anyway, so what is Fisher's theorem? The discrete version is right here. You can look at it, and I walked you through it. Now, I'll point out there's something really funny about this. So what does this mean? If you look at each generation, the mean fitness is increasing. Like it's at 0.6, it goes all the way to 0.86. What this is meaning is that more of the red rabbits that are really reproducing like rabbits, quote unquote, they're going to, eventually the population is going to be all red, pretty much, virtually. Minus, 99.999%. So it's going to approach 1. So that's what mean fitness means, that the population is getting more clonal by natural selection. And if you talk to conservation biologists, they'll say that's not really a good situation. We wouldn't consider that. We wouldn't consider a population that's all clonal to be really a good situation. So even there is a misnomer. And Stanley Southey pointed that out. He said that's a problem with Fisher's theorem, what it's really implying. And also more broadly, the way that they define fitness in the evolutionary sense. So all you're saying is the population isn't necessarily getting more complex. So let's take the example of Gammarus minus, where this cave fish that was out where this fish was out. No, sorry. Gammarus minus is not a fish. It's a crustacean. I'll call it a crab for lack of a better word. This crab-like creature. So it's out there in the open, and then finally it starts trying to dwell in the caves because it can be protected or for whatever reason, or it finds food. So now it starts losing its optical nerve, and that's why it's called minus, Gammarus minus, minus the eye.
You're saying there's another version that still has it. This one doesn't. Is that
right? So
okay.
It's Gammarus minus. That's the one Alan Orr was chiding Daniel Dennett on this and saying, look at Gammarus minus. So let's say the one that reproduces the most is Gammarus minus. So the guys that have lost their eyes. Well, over time in that cave, all of them are going to be blind. And in the Fisher's sense, and then in the sense of population genetics, now the populations become maximally fit. And like, you got to be kidding me. That has nothing to do with the questions we're trying to answer. So when people throw all this evolutionary literature at you and look at all the proofs of fitness increasing, just like, nah, I know what it's based on. So it's based on stuff like this that has nothing to do with biology.
So explain to the audience a little bit of how in terms of, as you just mentioned, the literature that's being thrown at you, like what supposed evidence for evolution is being tossed out that, if Fisher's theorem is actually accepted as incorrect, would no longer be valid?
Nothing. Because it's not even it's not even used, except it would make us laugh at Richard Dawkins for saying it's biology's central theorem. So basically the whole premise of fitness
doesn't really have a foundation,
right?
And is what you're saying. And as we mentioned earlier, it removes gigantic components of the complexities and such that need to be inserted into this equation to actually have a valid theorem for fitness that accounts for all the variables, or at least more of the known variables. Is that right?
Right. So let me just back this up a little bit. there is a major problem with the general concept of fitness itself. So let me back up a little bit. All these definitions I came up with here, like this is independent of Fisher's theorem.
Okay.
But all the other theorems in population genetics use these kind of definitions. And again, for the reader's sake, these are simplified versions. The original stuff is in Felsenstein's book, if you want to suffer through it. God bless Dr. Felsenstein. He made his book available for free. Just Google Joe Felsenstein, University of Washington. You'll find his webpage, and he has the population genetic book. You could find it. It's available for free. He's a very generous man. God bless him for that. So the problem is, if we take these definitions, and this is what Lewontin found to his horror. Lewontin and someone named Patrick Moran. So when they started to relax the assumptions that were in Fisher's theorem and started to include epistasis, multilocus, diploid, epistasis, and linkage, the things that you were saying where the genes start to regulate one another and have influence, they were horrified because they found out even under their own flawed definitions of fitness isn't guaranteed to maximize. And that was really devastating. That broke Lewontin's heart. He couldn't proceed after that. And
so
that's
I'm guessing that the whole this breakdown starts to dramatically raise the complexity and the improbabilities as a conundrum of okay, if this is not valid, then suddenly the extreme improbabilities are staring you in the face. Is that one of the elements that is now having to be accounted for?
Yes. Maybe more succinctly, and this is what I'm arguing in the paper, natural selection is not an agent for evolutionary change in the upward direction. Upward by meaning upward in complexity.
Right.
It will actually either resist it or against it, which is amazingly, it's summarized by Behe's latest book, Darwin Devolves. Darwin Devolves. And because when Darwin Devolves came out, I said, okay, let me, and this was also in the wake of Basner and Sanford's examination of the fundamental theorem of natural selection. We began looking at that, and I said, is that consistent with Behe's theme of Darwin Devolves? We started looking at the math. I said, oh, absolutely. On many levels, we could make that argument. I mean, a very simple way to make that argument, even using existing population genetic stuff, all we have to do is say, okay, let's say hypothetically that the quote unquote beneficial mutation in Gomeris minus is losing its eyes. Well, then you could show that this is, if we assume that fitness maximizes, natural selection is going to help destroy that poor creature's eyes. I mean, it's just, this ended up being a two-edged sword.
So there's no way around the reductionist component of all this. It had a function, now it does not. Therefore, natural selection resulted in a minusing, the name of a pre-existing, more complex feature.
Yes. And now the reason I'm going into this, now do you see why when I debated Ron Garrett, I laid it on the table. I said, the definitions of fitness are flawed. And I tried to show that potassium ion channel. I said, this is the way you want to define it in terms of nuts and bolts. And lo and behold, even in Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, from way back in 1996, he uses the word nuts and bolts. Man, I love that guy. Anyway, so there's probably way more to talk on about this, but there is the thing that was really devastating is recently, 2018, a gentleman by the name of Grodwall, Grodwhohl, Grodwall. He wrote the essay, peer-reviewed, the rise and fall of fitness maximization, and it was just devastating. I'm just like, he actually said they've quietly given up on it. But in the popular press, Richard Dawkins is saying this is biology's central theorem and how it's all been proven. It's like, don't believe any of that. If you read the actual literature, it's not. This stuff that you're seeing in the math here, I just go through the proof of Fisher's theorem. There is a continuous version that is way, way, way more complicated. And I have something kind of funny to say. So you read earlier at the beginning of the show what Fisher's theorem, how he stated it in words. Now, that wasn't very rigorous. I mean, it sounded like gobbledygook, and he didn't use any math symbols. And this is what George Price had to say in 1972. So like 42 years after Fisher's theorem came out, this is what Price had to say. Price was also a very good math guy. He said, "It has long been a mystery how Fisher derived his famous fundamental theorem of natural selection and exactly what he meant by it. Also, he spoke of the rigor of his derivation of the theorem and of the ease of its interpretation. But others have variously described his derivation as recondite, very difficult, entirely obscure, and no one has ever found any other way to derive the result that Fisher seems to state. Hence, many authors, not reviewed here, have maintained that the theorem holds only under very special conditions, while only a few have thought that Fisher may have been correct if only we could understand what he meant." Okay, so this is the father of neo-Darwinian theory. And maybe to beat a dead horse one more time. So my conclusion is Fisher may have envisioned, and he did, may have envisioned that his fundamental theorem was proof that evolutionary progress is inevitable. However, in view of the more common sense notions of fitness, where increase of fitness means the addition of higher complexity of organs and functions, Fisher's theorem does not guarantee such an increase. In fact, Fisher's theorem is perfectly consistent with the view that reductive evolution is the dominant mode of evolution. Beyond that, on many levels, Fisher's theorem has been given a negative assessment by Ewens and Lessard, was criticized for Price for not being understandable and to be incompletely derived. And Felsenstein rightly pointed out Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection is not so fundamental after all. All of these considerations are in stark contrast to Dawkins' characterization of Fisher's theorem as biology's central theorem. So there you have it. Now, a little bit of word about Basner and Sanford. Oh my goodness, you talk about really beating a dead horse. I think the fact that some of the criticisms among population geneticists, they were published, but they were kind of like quiet. And here comes along Bill Basner and John Sanford and said, we're going to pile on and we'll add mutations to Fisher's model. This is what's really funny. Fisher's model didn't even put mutations in his theorem. So Bill Basner and John Sanford said, well, what'll happen if we throw mutations in? And by the way, put lots of bad ones in. Let's see where it goes then. And it just crashed. So that was like really beating a dead horse. I think in the wake of that paper, and then when I joined on board the team, I said, hey, John, did you know that other people have been beating this dead horse for a long time too? He said, oh, really? I said, yeah, look at Felsenstein said, you published your paper in 2017 and here Felsenstein eulogizing Fisher. So that's why when I showed that picture of Felsenstein's memorial lecture, I thought that was so funny where he was eulogizing, he's, just like the two brothers, that the preacher was saying, he did all these bad things, but compared to his brother, he was a saint. That was just, anyway, now you see why I was especially laughing at all of this.
So it seems to me, one of the things I'm taking away from all of this is whether or not Fisher's theorem is still being actively used today. We've got probably no less than 40 to 50 years of supposedly development of other aspects of evolutionary theory that at the time were dependent on it being true. And then now we've got completely different things we're doing based on some of those assumptions or supposed proofs that have been derived from that originally being correct.
It wasn't even that good. Now, in Basner and Sanford's paper, they said that Fisher's theorem was foundational, but it was only foundational in a mythological sense. Hardly any population geneticist used it professionally. In Kimura and Crow's book on population genetics that they both published, they only had one little chapter on it. And they said, well, it's only one page. So it's amazing that we'll have this. There are 22,000 citations, I think, on Google Scholar of Fisher's theorem, and all these accolades piled on top of it. And the reason I showed that passage, no one really understood it, for one, until about 1972. No one, they couldn't understand even what it said, much less could they write a mathematical proof. But this myth built around it that it's biology's central theorem. Why? Because Fisher called it the fundamental theorem of natural selection, and he was saying this is like thermodynamics. And so I guess this is how the popular press and popular understanding can just take hold of a myth and make it gospel.
Do you think that mythology in regards to the complexity problem, right, of, oh wait, that's being solved already in the background, do you think that could have any bearing on the acceptance in regard of the plausibility of abiogenesis being able to occur? Not that they're actually people are going out and doing the math for themselves, but just saying, yes, we know for normal evolution, yes, we know it's stupidly complex, but hey, there's a theorem that shows this is possible. Therefore, we just haven't found the theorem that applies to abiogenesis complexity in a different context. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. When someone throws math at you and it looks like so much more complicated than you comprehend, it's like, well, these guys must be right. That looks so slick and smart. They must have figured it out. And at the time when I first looked at Fisher's theorem, I didn't understand it. And I asked other people, and it's just kind of like Price's experience. No one understood it, but they said it has to be correct. And that was really spot on. That was so spot on. And then just in the course of studying a little more, and after I was out of grad school, I was a little bit more math savvy, and I said, okay, I started reading Felsenstein's book. I said, the notation doesn't look like anything in my physics or math book. And I have a math degree and I have a physics degree. And I said, this is not reassuring, because why does this look a little bit funny? So then I tried to go through it, and I began to learn a little bit, postponed it. But then this past January, when I got recruited to revisit this, I'm just like, oh my goodness, it's a nothing theorem. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not relevant. And they're comments I made in this paper for the geeks who really want to suffer through it. I was just like, I talked to people. I said, it can't be this bad, could it? Where a myth is perpetuated and the people at the top really know the story, but they're just kind of like, they're not trying to make headlines. And I said, it couldn't be this bad. And then it's like, oh my goodness, it is this bad. So yes, it does perpetuate the myth. And one thing when you're talking about how this may have perpetuated, some of the best examples, one that Dawkins himself promoted, was weasel. How me thinks it like a weasel. See how easy evolution can. And
I'd forgotten about that, but yeah, I do remember that now.
Right. So Fisher's theorem works well with, you could take the weasel and do something like this. You could put it in, you could make it so that it agrees with Fisher's theorem. Even I could do that. A creationist like me could do that, and it'll look very profound. But to get to the crux of the matter, this whole thing with the difference between the engineering notion of fitness or the medical versus the population genetic, what if the evolutionary change is reductive? So that's a new word. You probably heard it before, but I'm going to try to emphasize it. Reductive evolution. What if the change is reductive. Well, then the best way to model that is not weasel, but something I called anti-weasel. And so in the Blythe Communications Journal, I'll be co-author of a paper called Anti-Weasel. And my co-author is Eric Holloway. It's just very simple. I said, we just take Dawkins' weasel, we just do the reverse. Instead of going toward the weasel, we go away from it. It's just like Gamiris minus, you have this complex feature, you're just going to avoid it because it's too metabolically expensive. I said, that'd be really cute. And we have lots of lab experiments. And this agrees with the book Darwin Devolves by Michael Behe. So on a lot of fronts, we're starting to see the genetic entropy argument move forward. But the literature is so big and there's so many smoke screens to cut through that it's hard to prosecute the case in just like a 1 hour, a 90-minute debate because there's so much material and there's been so much preconceptions about how natural selection works in people's minds that it's always, they think that natural selection works like intelligent selection, where you're trying to select for complexity, and that's not how it really works in nature.
You bring that up on the intelligent selection versus the natural selection. I noticed that in your debate with Ron Garrett, when y'all had a brief conversation about something being Turing complete, and I'm pretty close on the paraphrase here. He said, designing something that's Turing complete is not that hard. And what I remember when I heard that, what really struck me was A, the use of the word design, and B, the fact that you're referring to it not being difficult for an intelligent agent to do so. And I'm like, okay, I got no problem with that.
Yeah.
But you're not addressing the component of it's easy for an intelligent agent to do so. And I think in the context of what you're talking about here today, in terms of natural selection in relation to the evolutionary theorems, is you're almost assuming that it's always positive versus negative, right? That's what you're stating. And if you completely remove any potential negative variable, then yes, your premise of potential creativity through natural selection might have some validity if you remove all of the negatives from the equation completely and just act like they couldn't possibly exist, even though we know beyond doubt that they do.
I think even in Dr. Sanford's book, and it's been a long time since I've read that chapter, where he said, well, if you had even maybe half of them were beneficial changes, then evolution would move forward. But when you have these really skewed, these very funny looking distributions where it's almost all negative or neutral and maybe only a little bit beneficial, which I'd argue in some cases it's even zero. That's why I showed that potassium ion channel. That's nuts and bolts.
Right.
The only way for it to go is bad.
Right.
Because as Biolek is saying, so many of the things are optimized. It's perfect. You're not going to get better. So many things in biology are just perfect. So Professor Cardinal made a actually very, very valuable correction. He said it's not geometric fit. It's fit in terms of optimal affinity and specificity. I said, yeah, that's correct. I said, I thought I thanked him for that. If I didn't, thank you for saying that. That's actually will be helpful in my book as we define fitness in terms of engineering and physics principles. I mean, not that defining it in physics and engineering is going to be any easier, because how do you say that something's really physically fit? Because then it comes to be on a case-by-case basis whether the parts are optimized within the context of the overall organism. But I still think that is eminently a more reasonable way of looking things. And if evolutionary biologists are trying to argue that complexity arises by selection, they better tie it to this engineering notion, because when they decouple it, then the theorem, the natural selection is totally decoupled. It has no right to be arguing like Dawkins does.
So basically, what you're saying is if you do that decoupling, you're completely operating in a utopian hypothetical that does not actually take real world application into account. And therefore, while you may be able to come up with formulas that make it probable, it is now no longer logical or plausible. Is that
exactly
good way to twist my little my favorite words into this discussion?
Yeah, and Ron Garrett, in my debate with him, said, "Wow, I mean," he said, "if you're right, this is overturning everything." I said, "Yeah, that's Behe's Darwin devolves." Yeah. So
I've read that book as well. It's interesting to me. But when I was reading through it, it was like, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense. And the interesting part about, especially about his book, was you didn't require very much imagination in terms of comprehending or trying to apply or think of known things that would fit directly into what he was putting forth and what you're putting forth here today in your paper and in your discussions and everything and Dr. Sanford, all the things they've been talking about. It seems to fit the directly observable evidence and doesn't require any hypothetical scenarios in order to seem like a valid end conclusion of what we're observing. And for everybody who's making fun of me who just said y'all, I live in Nashville. I grew up in England. When I first moved back, I lived there for 18 years. When I moved back to the States for college, I used to make fun of people that said y'all. And fast forward 18 years, I've discovered that it's a way more efficient use of the English language. And I find it very strange to say you all. I think that just sounds weird to me. So, and plus it's way better when you hear it from a woman. So whatever.
I wanted to, could I advertise my my upcoming website where I'm going to be trying to post some of this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
It's evidenceandreasons.org. Very simple. Evidence and reasons. This is evidence and reasons for the Christian faith. And right now I don't have any content there, except I have an account of James Tour's conversion, where he was convicted in his heart that he needed Jesus. And when he was on his knees up there in his dorm room, he was accepting Christ into his heart, and he had a visitation from Jesus. A lot of people don't know that. Powerful testimony. And then I also put his critique of the origin of life. So some people...
I tell you, one of the interesting things I've seen from James Tour was his debates on Unbelievable with, is it Lee Cronin? Is that the... it was very interesting because I had actually watched Lee Cronin's debate on the exact same subject with a different person who wasn't a synthetic chemist of renown like James Tour. And in the previous debate, he had this extremely confident approach and just, everything is, I'm getting close and all these kind of things. Then he has the debate with James Tour, and it was like his confidence had taken a 180. Wow. And I thought it was I don't mean this to deride Lee Cronin at all, but it was interesting to me just in the context of, okay, you're in a position where you know that a person arguably of more credentials than you, Lee Cronin, he'll call you out if you try to argue that these things are just, already accounted for. And you're not going to be able to avoid this, And I was using this as an example because I see that starting to happen in different interactions where it's like, well, maybe I better not be too aggressive on these things because if I do, I may be setting myself up for professional embarrassment, given the fact that things that we now know. I'm hopeful to see much more of that as more of these things, these arguments that are being made, and also just the opportunities like what to do with your website and all these other organizations that are starting to bring these arguments and the conundrums that are facing academia, bringing them to YouTube and other places where the rest of us can start to kind of look into and analyze and be like, wait a minute, let me think about this. Maybe I don't have to just accept all of these arguments that are being made with such, utmost confidence when I recognize the shattering and the gigantic cracks in the foundations that have been being ignored for so many years and not even acknowledged, if you will, but now are no longer being able to be avoided.
Before we close the show, I hope we can hang out some more in future meetings. And I got a letter from Dr. Sanford regarding my book. The book, it's not my book, it'll be our book. So this is a great opportunity to be advertising it. He's now thinking along the thing that I was thinking is maybe we'll make booklets or even just short YouTubes and lectures. And so I was talking about the Polycomb repression complex, and he loves that one, the hot air, right, where something originates, is transcribed from chromosome 12. It navigates in that nuclear soup all the way to chromosome 2, goes to the Hox cluster, modifies one out of the 4 or 8, however you want to count it, histones, and modifies. He said, that was really good. I want more of that. And so the book will not be so much anti-evolutionary. It's going to be highlighting the wows of biology. We'll talk about the bird navigation and the shark sensing. And the one that he likes, the one he really, I'm sorry.
I would say that what you were just describing there on the going from chromosome 12 to chromosome 2, I mean, that's even expanding on the more simplified version of transchromosomal gene regulation, right?
Yep. Oh yeah, that was fun. And then the one that he liked the most, I said, yeah, that's kind of impressive. I said, the lowly E. coli bacteria can count molecules. And he was saying at the developmental stages of fruit flies, he thinks that the blastomere cell types are actually able to count individual molecules. It has to be able to keep count of molecules in order for it to be able to do what it does. I think it's a straightforward calculation based on the concentration of a certain substance that has to be shared among them. And then he did the math. He said, yeah, the way it's able to do its differentiate, how the cells are able to figure out who they are, they actually have to count molecules. I thought that was really impressive.
But that doesn't surprise me. I tell you what, another thing that I've come across I thought was very interesting is the molecular clock, not in the evolutionary sense, but in the actual time tracking for on a 24-hour period of different activation and deactivation of cycles and like different function. That when I came across that one, I know that one is probably a well-known one, but when I came across that piece of it, I'm like, hang on, there's a literal timekeeping molecule or protein that is keeping track of time. This is kind of cool. And
we call that Paley's watch.
Yep. I know, like I said, I know inside of the world of biology, I'm sure it's a rather well-known function, but I think for the average person, just the premise of like, wait a minute, how does it track time? I mean, that's for the common person, right? Of just like, what? Are you kidding me? And how does this? You think about it from a complexity perspective, like how does this even become a reasonable conclusion?
Yeah. So I have to tell you, this is. I'm glad we're doing this because I've met some, kids. I did some volunteer ministry at James Madison, and some of the students there said, "Well, we didn't want to look into the evidence because we were afraid we'll lose our faith if we started to study the facts." And I was like, "Oh Lord, give me a chance to just reach out to these people, let them know the facts are a lot more friendly to the Christian faith than you think." So we have these people that the way they defend their Christian faith is to kind of close their eyes. I mean, there's something to be said for that, and not hear the opposing views. And it's kind of scary to kind of venture out and just see what there is. And I nearly left the faith the more that I kept studying it. And I had bouts of agnosticism, and I just started looking at the science and just like, let me think about this. Do I really want to bet my soul on abiogenesis? And I said, nah, and then I started going through the odds, and it's been about 20 years now, and every year I'd say that I've been more convinced that there's intelligent design. And then when we look at the kind of all the tragedy and bad things in this world, it said like, well, it looks like intelligent design, but it's also cursed. That sounds like creationism. And so that's where I'm at. So I'm hoping you and I can have these short little, maybe shorter videos, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, where we can cover some of these really cool things and have a nice talk show. And I hope we have lots of laughs.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Try to be entertaining.
Yeah, it's interesting how you're talking about your path, right? What's the I'm drawing a blank on the exact verbiage, but the same I forget who the physicist was who said this, but when you start going down it's like when you start sipping from the cup of quantum mechanics, you lose your faith, and by the time you get to the bottom, it's stronger than ever. Yeah. And I think the same thing. I think the same logic applies to biology too. Like, oh, surface level. Okay, cool. Well, actually, the irony for me is with biology, I don't even think you have it on the surface level. I think the surface level answers the question for you in and of itself. But the deeper you go, the more it's to me anyway, more it's not a chance. Both on abiogenesis as well as the undirected processes of natural selection, just to me does not seem like a remotely plausible conclusion. Yeah, given the things that you're talking about today in this whole discussion.
Oh, thank you.
Like we're removing huge components of this while simultaneously not accounting for negatives. Everything's 100% positive, no negative to even put into our formulas. Like, in what other scenario would anybody think that is a rational conclusion, especially when we freely accept the premise of entropy,
So I don't have any more.
No, I think it's perfect.
Do you want to try to take some questions from the audience here who's been on the sideline?
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions they want to toss towards?
Before I just want to. That's my way of saying thank you for hanging with us.
I think we've started. People knew we were wrapping up, so they've started to drop off. But let's actually, next time we'll do a halfway point question and answer session when we got more people in the audience.
Yeah.
That way you won't have to be burnt out, and we'll get them while the questions are hot.
Yeah, this is a good warm up. Oh, Speed of Sound said, yes, John, where is that paper? So I'll let you answer that one, John.
So anyway, we're done for the day, and appreciate everybody for stopping by. If you're watching this after the live stream, hope you enjoy and actually take the time to dive in, listen to what Sal has been discussing, outlining, showing evidence for and against some of the foundational concepts that we are told cannot be questioned. And hope as you dive deeper and go and do your own research into the fundamentals of our existence, you will look for conclusions that are logical, plausible, and probable. They got to be all three. Otherwise, they're not valid. Have a good one, folks.
Have a good one.